All right, welcome to another Bow of the Father. We have one person here other than me, which is great. So
One
at least,
guess,
at least
yeah.
we can have a conversation. So that's wonderful. Um, so yeah, again, this is kind of an open floor. Anything anyone wants to talk about, that's what we're here for.
Okay. Two questions, and
Yeah.
we'll take the first one first.
Mhm.
I didn't know about one of the verses. I think it's in either Matthew or Mark. The return of the unclean spirit.
Uh-huh.
In
Yeah.
reading so, it says if the spirit gets out and you clean your home, uh, it's very confusing how it says
Yeah.
the spirit may turn or change it. How does that? What's Jesus or what is the Bible trying to tell
Yeah.
us
Well,
there?
I think what Jesus is trying to reveal something about the spiritual life, that how difficult it is to get our life in order and how easy it is for that to be turned upside down, right? So what Jesus kind of talked about in the context of that passage is really about like temptation and sin, right? So now we would also say that kind of applies to possession, right? Specifically, I mean, so we're talking about like how Satan interacts with humanity. There's kind of four main ways, and we've talked about this before. I don't know, but the first way is the most common way is like temptation, right? So we all experience that.
Hmm.
The second way would be what we call obsession. So, like, if I were to, let's say, put this cup down here on the table and lock the doors of this building, no one can come in, borrow them, let's say, and I come in the next morning and the cup is, let's say, in the kitchen. That's a sign of obsession, right? That there's some kind of action of the evil one that's trying to maybe drive me crazy in some way, right? And that's a pursuit of my soul. The third way elevated would be like infestation. So that's kind of getting more like what Jesus is talking about, right? That when we actually started allowing these things to happen in our life, that there's a progression of these things. And infestation is like you would think like haunted house, right? So many evil spirits maybe that are kind of surrounding you and kind of maybe trying to drive you to make further decisions to actually give over your soul, right? So it's important to understand when we talk about things like exorcisms, right? That um, typically someone doesn't just become possessed with one action. It's kind of a
It's
series
a
of
gradual.
progressions, right? A series of yeses that kind of build off each other. And the same way it takes those series of progressions the other way, it's actually like kind of reject, right? So we understand that we're given grace to help us with that, but we still have the choice to make, right? We can choose to do evil, and we can choose to do good. And grace helps us choose, make it easier for us to choose good, and rejecting that grace makes it easier to choose evil. And so I think what the Lord's talking about in that parable is kind of how that works in our spiritual life, kind of emphasizing with the parable how we receive these things, right? So yeah, if let's say we get to the point where, hey, we're doing really well, we have our house in order, we're doing it's very simple, but even in that state, we can still reject God's grace and ultimately turn it over and allow that all to come in, right? And that's really what we call mortal sin, right? That one mortal sin can sever our relationship with God, cause disorder, and allow Satan to just kind of run roughshod through our house, right? And that's kind of scary when we think about it. That one mortal sin I choose, and that's the point, is I know about it and I choose it,
Hmm.
can overturn my house and allow Satan just to drop me down farther than maybe it was before, right? But also, we also understand, and again, the context parable, that God's grace is greater. And all we need to do is choose it again, right, to rebuild, right? So the point is that God does not abandon us. We can abandon him, but he's always going to be faithful, right? And provide that, constantly share that grace upon us so we can maintain that balance, that order. But we also can choose to have disorder too, right?
Yeah, you got to watch the cracks where
Oh, yeah.
the devil wants to get
Oh,
in.
yeah. And that's Ignatius was very good about that. He talked about in his rules of discernment, um, his 15th rule was about how we guard against that. That he used an analogy of like a general or a king defending his castle.
And who wrote?
This is Saint Ignatius of Loyola,
Okay.
right? So what Saint Ignatius is brilliant in the fact that he's very practical in the spiritual life. And so what he kind of discusses is that when we're not feeling this attack, and we're feeling more consolation, that's the time we actually build up our defenses where we're weakest. Because the other part of that analogy is that Satan is a very cunning general, and he's going to attack us at our weakest point, right? And so as a good king, when we're in times of consolation, we need to build up that area of our weakness so that it can become strong, right?
Always looking for that ambush.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah.
So it was very confusing. Sometimes in the Bible, when I'm reading, I think I take things very literally, and sometimes things are very literal, you know. So it was just trying to apply that to my life. But it is all over, whether the simple decisions we make to let somebody upset us at a stop sign, or to make a wrong decision at work, or to make a better decision with close relationships and people.
Yeah, and I think that also shows a relationship between like venial sin and mortal sins. I mean, you mentioned like the example of like at a stoplight and maybe someone cuts me off or whatever, right? Well, okay, I mean, you know, again, there has to be a level of deliberation involved and an act of the will when we talk about mortal sin, right?
Right.
So in other words, it's one thing to say this guy cuts me off. It's like, man, I know I shouldn't flip this guy off. I really know that's wrong. I know that's not an act of charity. I know that's not good for him or for me. But darn it, I'm going to do it anyway. Right? Mortal sin, right? That's a mortal sin. That does sever our relationship with God and puts us in a state that we're not receiving the grace in the way it should be given to us. Yeah. That's much different than, oh man, this guy, you know, a reactionary, right? That's still venial, it's still wrong, but it doesn't have the same impact as if we're actually deliberating it and then do it anyway, right?
Yeah.
And so, but of course, you know, those small venial sins can still lead us down that path to keep on choosing those things, right? I think the big example of that is really more kind of violations of the fifth and sixth commandment. So we talk about like, you know, when I talk about fifth commandment, I don't mean like murder, you know, but you know, self-mutilation is part of the fifth commandment too. When we talk about like alcohol, drugs, right? I mean, so the church kind of teaches in general that everything in moderation, within reason, right? So like alcohol is one of those things where you can calculate in some ways, like based on my weight and my height, you know, how much it might take for me to drink alcohol before I lose control of my faculties.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes we get into a state where we're not really thinking about that. And so in other words, getting drunk without actually wanting to get drunk is much different than I'm going out tonight, I'm going to put a rager on, I'm just going to get hammered, and I don't care what happens. I think one you would say is venial, the other one's mortal.
Right.
Right. So, but in the case of the venial, I can do that without intending to do it, and recognize that, oh, you know, that was kind of fun, right? And kind of leads me then down that path of mortality. Or even worse, maybe I can become addicted to these things. And drugs is a little more severe, right? I mean, so there's a big debate right now about marijuana, right? And what the church teaches about that. And the church, again, moderation is key. I think the struggle with marijuana, though, is that you don't know exactly how much is enough, right? Part of that is we don't necessarily have data to show that, oh, if I have this joint, I'll be fine, compared to maybe like, I don't know, 4 joints, right?
Right. The
effect could be the same whether it's 1 or 4, right? We don't actually have information to say that, oh yeah, for a person this size, that's enough. We don't have that. And with even harder drugs like, you know, crack or cocaine or heroin or now fentanyl, it's even more severe. That I may have maybe a little bit, and I'm hooked for good, right? So we have to take that in consideration of reason and what reason dictates. And so when it comes to these things, we have to kind of be prudent in saying, I don't think I should do this because I don't know what kind of effect it's going to have on me. That's different than saying, I might try to see what happens, and much more different than, I'm just going to try it and I don't care. Right? Yeah. So those things really kind of build on each other in some ways. Pornography is even kind of worse. That there's such a dopamine flow from these things, and even the other things. There's a change in your brain chemistry that changes your thought patterns that become easily addicted, right? And so, in that state of addiction, you may not be committing mortal sin because you're not necessarily choosing that anymore. But maybe the steps leading up to that may be mortal sin. right? And even that's kind of an act of cunning on the part of the evil one, right? And so when you're reading these things in the Bible, when you're kind of questioning about like whether it's literal or figurative, Jesus typically uses analogy when he's talking about figuratively, right? He says like it is like, right, or it's like when a sower goes out to sow or something. That's more figurative speech. But even those analogies convey some truth that we don't want to usually take away. And typically in the scripture, he'll always go to his apostles and explain it, right? If he's talking figuratively. So that also cues us in whether Jesus is talking like more figurative or literally too. Yeah. But yeah, I mean these small things can build up and actually cause great harm and even lead to mortal sin.
Yeah.
Because we're keep on saying yes to those things in even small ways.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the Christian life is not easy.
Right? No, not one bit.
And then Satan definitely is. He's smart. He's smart. He knows us in many ways better than we know ourselves. And so he's going to attack us where we're weakest.
Right.
Because he knows where our weak points are.
Yeah.
Actually, something else to read maybe, and this is it's a great read. It's not hard, not a really difficult, not a very long read, but a very good one is the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. I think I've talked about that one before. I don't know if you were here for that.
I don't think I was.
So in that book, C.S. Lewis kind of puts this. It's kind of a series of letters being written back and forth between. Really, it's more one-sided. Actually, it's this junior demon who's writing to his uncle, who's a higher demon named Screwtape, and he's kind of been assigned this person to tempt and will the master's will upon this soul. And so he's writing to his older, wiser uncle to determine like, how do I do that best, right? So here's a scenario. What should I do? And so then it's kind of recapping what the uncle says, and then kind of writing back, thinking that what. So it's actually kind of a very fascinating kind of monologue, but it's really kind of a dialogue where you don't actually hear the actual voice of the other person being written to. But it's fascinating that in where it talks about the moral life and how we fall to temptation, right? And actually, there was kind of a movie that released just recently. Oh man, I can't. It escapes my remembrance now, but it came out just like last year, and it was about this guy on death row in Oklahoma, and he claimed to be possessed, and so they couldn't lawfully execute him because he wasn't in a state. They're trying to determine if he's actually possessed or if he's actually like mentally incapacitated, in which case they couldn't lawfully execute him, right? So they bring in this psychiatrist to come and talk to this guy, and it's kind of been called the modern day Screwtape Letters because it kind of reveals in the way this guy how he responds to these things. And I won't want to ruin it because it is a good movie, and I really would encourage anyone to go out and watch it. It actually is really, really good. I think it was on Amazon, but I think you probably find it anywhere now. But he kind of says, he starts the conversation by saying, before this is the man talking to the psychiatrist, before you leave here today, you're going to kill 3 people, right? And it's like, okay, whatever. And the way he progresses into that it's masterful. And the actor, again, his name escapes my memory right now, but he was actually in Boondock Saints. I ever saw that movie.
I'm familiar with
that. He was in that movie. Oh, brilliant acting performance. Because he kind of flips him out between this person who claims he's possessed and this Satan, these demons, right? Yeah. It's really fascinating. And boy, if I can remember it, I'll put it on the description on this video if I remember it. I'll look it up and I'll put it on there. But yeah, those are really kind of good examples of like how Satan does interact with us and how cunning he actually is. Yeah. So yeah, good stuff.
On a day-to-day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Good. Any other questions?
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
And it's only because through Lent I've been reading. So recap for me the last, before the Last Supper.
Mhm.
So one of Jesus's favorite reclined upon his chest and said,
His beloved.
his beloved,
His beloved,
his
right.
beloved,
Right,
right?
right. We don't say his favorite, but his beloved.
So
yeah,
his
right.
beloved. And
That's actually the gospel today, right?
is that right?
Yeah. So at the Last Supper, right? And so Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me,
Mhm.
right? And so Peter kind of like nods over to John. John's the beloved, right? Because he's sitting next to Jesus.
So that was my question.
Yeah.
So then at the end of John,
Yeah. Like the end of the Gospel of John?
at the end of the Gospel of
Yeah.
John,
Yeah.
Peter is following Jesus, like, come on. And Peter looks over and he says, there is that one that reclined onto Jesus.
Right.
But the person's name wasn't mentioned. I didn't know.
Right.
So I was wondering who that
That's
apostle
John.
was.
That's John.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Gospel of John, in some ways, John is very, very critical, specifically of really himself and the other apostles, and humble in the same way. So he never actually names himself as this person, right? But whenever he talks about his beloved one, or like, his beloved disciple, that's John. And the reason that it's referred to that way is because John was thought to be the youngest of the apostles.
That's because it was 90 years
Right.
after.
Right.
Okay.
So John was the last one to die. Right.
Now the pieces are coming together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's another thing too. We kind of it's kind of hard for us to comprehend because we kind of picture these apostles like older men, like 40, maybe 50, maybe 30, 40, 30. But in reality, when Jesus first interacted with them, they probably were all in their teens. Peter was thought to be the oldest, but even Peter, maybe late teens, early 20s, right? When Jesus actually first connected with them. John was probably thought to be 12, 13 when he first interacted with Jesus.
Wow.
Right. So he was a man in the eyes of the people because
Right.
13, but in the eyes of like society today, very, very young. Right. Jesus would have been the oldest by far of everyone there. Right. I think it's also interesting that we kind of think of that, Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry. Well, in that time, that was like the age of a grandfather.
Yeah.
A man who was in his 30s probably would have had his children's children around by then, because they would get married and have children very young.
Very young.
Mary was like maybe 14.
They didn't have great health care back then.
Right. Well, they would have died relatively early.
Right.
We're not necessarily sure how old Mary was, or even how old Joseph was when he died, but maybe 40s, 50s. Mary probably didn't take too long following Jesus, but even at the time of Jesus' death, she would have been probably around early 40s, which, today isn't that old.
No,
but back then,
too young today.
yeah, but back then she would have been very, very old. And maybe she probably was assumed maybe 10, 15 years later. So early 60s, late 50s, maybe. Assuming she was taken care of, which why wouldn't she have been? Because she had John, she had the other apostles and everyone. Everyone would have known her, and they would have, probably provided for her.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about that. But yeah, when we talk about the beloved, he was the youngest, and so he was sort of like a grandchild to Jesus in some way, right? And we kind of see that. I don't know about you guys, but I have 5 nieces and nephews, and the way my mom and dad interact with them was much different than
Right.
when you're growing up, right?
Right.
And again, I don't want to say they probably love them more. I'm not going to say, but I don't blame them. I love them very much too. I probably love them more than I love my sisters. I love my sisters, but I would do anything for these nieces and nephews. So I get it.
Yeah.
But I think there's probably something to that,
Yeah.
But yeah, the beloved would have been John, right? And so part of that too is also there's a little bit of coding involved too. Because you have to understand when these gospels were all written, there was a great persecution going on, right? This would have happened after Nero, after Rome burned, after the destruction of Jerusalem. These are kind of being written at a time where there was going to be great persecution. So using coded language was probably beneficial so that people didn't know the identities and try to
Yeah.
seek out these people and
Yeah.
kill them, right? So yeah, it's pretty intense. But yeah, but beloved disciple was John. And I think it was interesting about that too. We're told that in the gospel when Mary Magdalene came back and told them, we're told that the beloved and the Peter ran to the tomb, and the beloved one got there first, but didn't go in.
It didn't go in.
And that's actually very telling, because what that shows is actually the headship of Peter.
Because he was older?
He was the Pope, right? So now maybe it was elderly, but also this recognition of, well, look, this guy, he's the head. I'm not the head.
Yeah.
I may be beloved, but he's got to go first because he's in charge, right? Yeah, that's another reason why we would say that the papacy was established by Christ too, right? Which is debated oftentimes, right?
Yeah.
So if the apostles recognize that, well, we probably should too. Especially the beloved disciple recognize that. Well, then,
yeah.
Paul even recognized that. When Paul was doing his thing, he, even though he chastised Peter for especially Peter's interaction with when he was with the Gentiles compared with the Jews. So he was, Paul did call him out, like, hey, when you're with the Gentiles, you kind of act Gentile, and with the Jews, you're kind of being two-faced, right? But he still submitted to Peter's will. That when the brothers got together and decided, here's what we're going to do forward, and Peter promulgated that, okay, you're the head.
True.
So I think it's so fascinating that 1,500 years later, there's sort of this rejection. And, you could say, well, the experience at the time that the papacy was, I mean, we've had some bad popes, and you witness these things that these popes have done. And, it was funny, I was watching a podcast, and they were talking about who are the worst popes. I think it was Jimmy Akin. It was on Pints with Aquinas. And he was saying, I think it was Alexander the Sixth was probably the worst we ever had. And what Alexander the Sixth probably kind of, the reason is he had these certain illegitimate children he had put in certain positions. And, his mistresses were kind of put in certain positions. And, but even Alexander the Sixth never actually promulgated heresy. He never taught anything contrary to the faith. And what's so amazing about that is none of the popes ever did. You can go back in history and look at everything they wrote, and even have recorded what they actually thought, right? So there were certain popes that maybe had a more of a monophysite or monotheist idea of Jesus. So what that means is kind of this belief that Jesus only had one will and one mind, one intellect. Well, okay, even though a pope maybe thought that, they never promulgated it, right? Meaning they actually wrote that down and said, here's what we believe as a church. Go do that. Never, right? Now that those heresies were overcome in further ecumenical councils, but that just goes to show, I think, that the Holy Spirit was protecting the papacy. I think we have applied that to certain popes today. I mean, no matter who's on the chair of Peter, I think everyone has a different opinion or an approach to the personality, to the, what the Pope says off the cuff or in interviews or whatever, and have reactions to those things. I mean, I think it's interesting that like Ratzinger was, Benedict XVI was kind of thought to be this ultra conservative, and he was going to bring us back to the pre-1962 church and whatever else. And then of course Pope Francis gets this kind of rap of being like this really hippy dippy, like whatever.
Totally the other way.
Well, exactly right. But it's like they all teach the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, and that's why I always think it's interesting when people come talking about these things. Like it's like, well, here's the thing. I don't care what he says. I don't care what he says to reporters. I don't care what he says in an airplane. I don't care what he says to his biographer. All I care about is what he says on the chair of Peter. And so far, everything he said on the chair of Peter does not contradict the faith or the teachings of the church. So he's the Pope. That's all I know.
Yeah.
I can have an opinion. We all have an opinion of him. Fine. But why get wrapped around the axle about this?
Right.
Because I think part of that, especially as Americans, we tend to bring in our political aspects into the church. I would be interested in seeing how many people, whether here at St. Anne or otherwise, if you were to say, can you tell me how you describe yourself? maybe using like 3 words. How many of us actually would describe ourselves as Catholic first or second or third? I think we're such in a society today that they would look at more their political affiliation.
Yeah.
And we tend to do this in everything, but I think a lot of people project that onto the church. So it was funny. I was having a conversation today about with one of our staff. I won't say who, but this person was kind of like, "Well, you're kind of traditional." Huh? I'm like, "Well, I don't know what that means. I mean, I guess to love tradition is to love Catholicism. So yeah, I would say maybe that's the case. I wouldn't put it in those terms. I would say that you have Orthodox priests and you have non so Orthodox priests." And this person was like, "What's the difference?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know. I think an Orthodox priest upholds all the truths that are taught by the church. An Orthodox priest may not, right? And maybe that's a lack of understanding. To be charitable, I don't know. I don't know what a person knows or what they want to profess, but I know that before I got ordained, I had to make a profession and a vow that I was going to uphold all the teachings of the church, right? So every priest has to do that. And so if they're not maintaining that vow, in my opinion. But again, that also depends on what they know, what they understand. I made the point that there are certain priests in our archdiocese, brother priests. I call them brother priests because they are priests. But they maybe tend to take liberties with the liturgy, meaning maybe they'll make up their own words for prayers, whether it be the prayers in the missal or even, unfortunately, during the Eucharistic prayer. And to me, if that were me, that'd be a matter of a confession for me, right? Because I know better. And we can talk about formation, because I think some of my brothers who are a little bit older that maybe formed in the seminary around the 70s, maybe 80s, there was still a lot of confusion after Vatican II about what the Mass was and everything else. And so, maybe there was less emphasis because they were still trying to figure it out. And I don't know. I'm not going to judge anyone for that because we're all products of the seminary we come from. But to not say the black and do the red, that to me, that's pretty basic. That's a minimum we all should be doing, right? But again, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think we definitely have some ways to go, I think, with that. And so I don't know how we got for this from the papacy and John and all, but hey,
no, it's good. It's good.
Yeah. Well, good. Any other questions, thoughts?
Oh, one revisit.
Yeah.
So back to when John leaned on Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus says, it's who I give the bread to after I dip it. So during the Mass, you said every time during Mass, we take a little trip back in time, and you do something during the Mass with the consecration of the host. So I missed it when you were when you were said. So
during the consecration, the consecration is when we actually say the words and it becomes Jesus, right? So that's primarily what we call the consecration. We tend to apply that to the entire Eucharistic prayer, but the entire liturgy of the Eucharist is kind of this bringing back to these moments, right? So I think what you're talking about, John, is when there's a point where the priest breaks the host after consecration and puts a little piece into the chalice.
That's what I missed.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I was wanting to know about.
So that is a bringing back to the resurrection. So, so at the Last Supper, it becomes body and blood. At the end of the Eucharistic prayer, we elevate both the unbroken body and the blood separated to represent the crucifixion. That's the death. His body and blood are separated at his death. After we say the Our Father during the Lamb of God, not many people notice this, but in the rite, it says the priest breaks the host, takes a small piece, puts it into the chalice. And then that actually is being brought present to the resurrection. Because now his body and blood are back together.
Back together. Okay,
right?
So that's what you're...
Yeah.
I wanted you to explain that to me once more. Okay.
Yeah. And so...
Has nothing to do with when Jesus was dipping the bread and handing it to...
No. Because, well, in some ways it might be, because we talk about the distribution of the body and the blood, right? Well, Judas received the body and blood of Jesus too.
Yeah.
Judas was a validly ordained priest. Judas received the Eucharist, and he still betrayed him. And I think for us, that's also a lesson that we have that within us too, right? We all have kind of that side where we betray him through our sin, through our actions, whatever it may be, even though we may receive the Eucharist validly, right? And so part of that's a message for us to be on guard for those things.
Yeah.
So we don't turn to Judas. Judas is such a fascinating topic, though. He's such a fascinating figure. We don't know. We know that he was probably a zealot, more than likely, and a zealot was kind of those that were looking for political power in Israel to overthrow the Romans. So his idea of Jesus may have been the traditional idea that he was going to be this military figure, and maybe just never caught on to him. Some more popular depictions of him have been like, you think like Jesus Christ Superstar. So it was kind of thought Judas was trying to motivate Jesus to be that Messiah, right? So maybe good intended, but definitely misguided.
Yeah.
And so when it was kind of determined he wasn't that Messiah, well, there's two schools of thought. Either he was so filled with regret that drove him to kill himself, or so filled with despair that it drove him to kill himself. Right? So we know he killed himself. That's for sure. He hung himself and died. But we also know from the Gospels that he was in charge of the money bag. So John was very explicit. He said, "Oh, you used to steal." Well, none of the other real gospel writers say anything about that. So John would have been there. He would have known. So you would think Matthew might have been the guy who held the money, but
because the tax collector.
Right, but I don't know. We don't know again what Judas' background. What maybe he was more qualified, but also Jesus has a way of taking the unqualified and making them qualified. So
so Judas in the Bible, in my study Bible, there's two phrases. It said Judas Iscariot and Judas the Iscariot. So is Iscariot a last name, a job that his family had?
So it would have been more like a surname. So we say like Jesus of Nazareth, right?
Okay.
So it's really a way to distinguish him from other Judases, right? So, that's the other thing too. Like the word Judas derives still from the same word Jesus, which is Joshua, right? Yeshua, right? So Jesus would have been called Yeshua in his own native language. And Judas may not have been Galilean. He may have been Judean, in which case they would have probably pronounced it Judas instead of Joshua, right?
Right.
So maybe it's a way to make a distinction with other Joshuas or Judases of who he actually was. So that actually, the Iscariot was thought to be his father's name, right?
So that because it said his father was the Iscariot.
Right. So son of the Iscariot. So he's from the house of Iscariot.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So whatever that means.
Right.
So it's just it's a very fascinating figure, and it's funny in the Eastern Church they actually venerate him as a saint.
I don't like it had to be done. Somebody had to do it.
That's kind of the rationale is that it had to happen, and somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
So because we're told even very early in the Gospels that Jesus knew who was going to do it.
Who was going to do it,
and he still did it anyway.
But I liked as soon as he gave him the bread, the devil entered, and Jesus was like, "Okay, get out of here.
Right.
Get going.
Right.
Go do what you want to do. Get away from me."
Well, also the privateness of that too. It's like, do what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Right then and there.
And so, but even then, there's still a choice, right? Kind of puzzles him like, what you're going to do quickly. So it's almost like, well, if you're going to go do it now.
Yeah.
And if you're not, well, then don't do it now, right? Either stay or go. Your call.
Yeah.
Right. But again, I think it kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, that those choices that Judas made kind of led up to that point. They kept on, these kind of constant of
he was talking to the soldiers, and he was. Right. This is not just something that happened an hour beforehand. He must have been plotting it.
Well, I might be telegraphing my homily for tomorrow, but there's a reason we call it tomorrow Spy Wednesday, right? Because the gospel is talking about how Judas went to the Pharisees and the scribes and started plotting with them and looking for a time to turn them in, right? So this would have happened during this week, maybe even the same day, like maybe it was today or Wednesday before the actual feast. And so we call it spy because Judas then becomes a spy, right? And a spy lives a double life, right? They have their foot in two places. They're basically to have motives that aren't in line with the motives of people around them. And it seems Judas was doing that, right? And so this opportunity arose, and he's like, okay, here's why I'm here, so let's do this, right? But even then, I mean, it's still kind of fascinating to think about. Like, he may have just still been thinking, like, okay, he's going to do it. Okay, this is going to be it. We're going to call these soldiers in. He's going to finally show his power. He's going to call people to arms, and here we go, right? Oh, he's not. And then he starts seeing him getting beat, and this trial goes on, and it's like, then the next day even, right? Like, okay, now he's about to, okay, now he's going to about to pile. This has got to be it. He's going to finally make a stand, and here we go, and nothing.
Yeah.
And as he's being led up to the Via Dolorosa, this figure who had, I guess, this misguided hope, either has such a sincere, contrition that he realized what he'd done that drives him to despair, or the fact that this person isn't who he thought he was drives him to despair. And that leads to his ultimate demise. Now, of course, we always want to hope for the best, that at the moment there was maybe this act of repentance on Jesus' part, and God would provide that grace for him.
Yeah.
Because Jesus also died for him too.
Yeah.
Right. We don't know. We can hope, right? And that's, I think, why the Eastern Church does venerate him, because they say, well, he had that role. He fulfilled God's will.
Yeah.
And we would hope that he would have some repentance in those moments, as a priest, as a bishop, as a follower of Jesus. I think that's a good thing to reflect on, and actually kind of, there's reason there to say that's the case, right?
Absolutely.
But I think, unfortunately, we couldn't say for sure because, well, how many people actually pray for Jesus' intercession, and how many miracles are attributed to him, right? So,
and Jesus told his father, I didn't lose any but one.
Right.
I only lost one.
Right.
And he said he lost.
Right.
You don't know.
So we don't know, right? But maybe Judas wasn't the one, right?
Okay.
I mean,
you don't know.
Because here we don't know. I mean, how many people actually rejected Jesus? It's funny. The Holy Father's made a comment, which I don't know why people get wrapped in the axle. He says he hoped nobody's in hell, right? Yeah, we should all hope that. We should all hope that.
We should.
Now the reality is, there probably are,
right?
But we should still hope that people aren't in hell.
Yeah, I don't know how that got construed as being bad.
I don't get it either.
Bad for business.
I really don't understand that, but whatever. But I mean, that's the thing. Like, is it possible other people reject? Well, yeah. I mean, many of the leaders, the Pharisees and the people there, rejected him.
Yeah.
He was all alone on the cross.
Yeah.
Right. And so, is it possible that Judas wasn't the one? Sure.
It is.
Right.
Absolutely.
If we're talking about all eternity. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who knows? We'll find that out when we're with him, I guess.
Amen.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Good talk.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Well, I guess all we got for tonight is a quick night for Holy Week. That sounds good. So I can go to bed early tonight. That works out. Perfect.
Right on.
All right.
Right on.
Thanks, guys. We'll see everyone next week. Oh, next week we're going to have Friends Who in Faith. So I think next week we're going to actually talk about divine mercy. So it was put in on our, you'll see in the bulletin this week in my article, we're putting a divine mercy sign out on the front lawn outside the door of the church. And as we're getting ready for Divine Mercy Sunday, it might be good just to talk about that. So that's what we're going to talk about next Tuesday. Again, here 6:30 in the dining room. So feel free to come, or you can watch later. Either way works. See you guys later. Happy Easter.